Hello friends! Today I'm going to be showing you step by step how to sew the Kaylie pattern. If you don't know what pattern I'm talking about and you want to know about it, I would recommend watching this video. That'll tell you all you need to know about that pattern as well as the other two that it comes with. And if you want to see the tutorial for the Clueless and the knife skirt, that tutorial is going to be coming out in 2 days after this one, and it will be linked in the description box below. These are currently listed in my Ko-fi shop, which will be linked down below. This tutorial is split into little chunks and put in chronological order so that you can skip around and find the parts that you might need help with. And if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, thank you baby, feel free to leave a comment below. Maybe someone else is having a similar problem. Anyways, let's get into the tutorial. Oh, hi baby! To prepare your fabric to cut out, go ahead and fold it in half and line up the edge of the pattern piece on the fold that is meant to be lined up on the fold. And then go ahead and cut out the side of the fabric that has the seam allowances for the bootlegger pocket. Be sure to fold the hem guide to the appropriate length. Here you see I've got mine folded to the Dazzler length, but there is also the Kawaii length and the Librarian length. You can see here that I'm picking up the guide and moving it along my fabric to cut the appropriate length as I go, being careful to line up the top edge with the top edge of my fabric every time I move it. I cut out the waistband on the fold, and I make sure that the stripes are going in a direction that I want. It doesn't matter if this pattern piece is cut on the warp or the weft. However, it does matter very much that you mark it appropriately. Transfer the dotted lines onto your pattern piece with whatever marking method you prefer. Assuming that you're going to be cutting both a bootlegger pocket and a side welt pocket, go ahead and start by cutting the bootlegger pocket. To do this, go ahead and cut all the way along the edge of the pattern piece, and don't worry about marking the welt pocket at all because you won't be using it. However, do remember to mark the little rectangle shape at the top edge. Later on, you're going to do a zigzag stitch along this line and then trim the fabric so that it can be free to open. Also, if you're going to be cutting a Dazzler length skirt, go ahead and fold your pattern piece along the dotted line so that your pocket doesn't stick out past the hem of the skirt. While cutting out the side welt pocket, go ahead and fold in the tabs on either side because you won't need the extra seam allowance for this one. Go ahead and cut around the entire perimeter, remembering to fold along the dotted line if you're doing a Dazzler length skirt. And do remember to mark the welt pocket mark with your preferred marking method. During this cutting and marking stage, I also like to mark all of my little pleat lines, both with a chalk line and a little pin for easy handling later whenever I go ahead and pleat them. When I come to the end of the first panel, I go ahead and I mark my welt pocket line with my preferred marking method, and then I'll unfold my fabric and line up my pleat guide and continue on marking my pleats. As you can see here, I overlap the pleats where the last one left off and continue on the pattern the same way I had been doing on the first half of the skirt panel. I may have to slide a little bit when I get to the end because it's not perfectly lined up with the edge, but that is fine. It's way easier to make sure that I've got my pattern in order and then slide my guide around a little bit than to perfectly line up the pattern piece and have to do a little bit of guesswork or, God forbid, math. And if you would like your Kaylie skirt to have pockets, you'll want to cut out 2 of pattern piece number 4 and 4 of pattern piece number 5. In order to make the side welt pocket, take pattern piece number 3 and fold the seam allowance tabs under. You won't need those for this pocket. Seam allowance is included, so just cut all the way along the pocket. If you're going to be sewing a Dazzler length skirt, do remember when cutting out your pocket that you need to fold at the dotted line so that it doesn't stick out under the hem of your skirt. Before moving on, mark the welt pocket marks on the skirt as well as the welt pocket lining. You're going to pin these to each other. It doesn't have to be exact, but it needs to be good enough. Follow the lines with a straight stitch on your machine. When you come to a corner, you can put the needle in the down position and lift the foot to rotate your work and get a perfect 90-degree angle. Then to finish your welt pocket, you're going to cut right down the middle, and right before the end, stop and cut into the corner very gently and carefully so that you don't clip your seam. Then turn your pocket inside out and iron very well. You're going to want to press your seam allowance in towards the skirt instead of toward the welt pocket itself. Pay special care on that bottom edge, don't forget about it, and give everything a really good press from the outside. You may want to top stitch around this edge before continuing. Your welt pocket should fall on a pleat that will be covered by another pleat. To finish up your pocket, you're going to need to sew the bag to itself. Go ahead and fold it over and pin that seam. Take it over to your machine and do a straight stitch all along the edge. You may want to do a zigzag stitch as well to prevent it from fraying in the future. The top edge of your pocket is going to be naturally attached to the skirt whenever the waistband is installed, so the bottom edge of your pocket is what you're going to need to finish. Just go ahead and do another straight stitch with a zigzag and you will be done. Pleating your skirt panel is very important. First, what I'm going to do is iron my seam in the side where I connected my panels together, but if you cut one continuous strip, you will not need to do this. In order to make a box pleat, take the pin that is on the line that was marked, fold in towards center, and you're going to fold that in towards center. The fold mark is going to fold and disappear, and you'll do the same thing in reverse on the other side, creating a box pleat. I like to remove my pins as I go and pin my pleats down as I work across my skirt. I normally start at one end instead of starting in the middle like I did here, because that makes it easier to use my pattern as a reference and pin as I go. As you pin, be sure that you are taking up a full pleat's worth of material, or else your skirt panel is going to wind up being too long. Alternatively, you also don't want to overlap your folds of your pleats, or else your panel will come out a little bit too short. Before basting your skirt down, be sure to iron all of those folds in, just to make life a little bit easier for yourself. This will also help the finished garment to lay nice and flat. Before basting your pleats into place, be sure to check the length of your skirt panel and be sure that it's lined up appropriately. And as you baste, be very careful as you go that your panels don't get stretched out. The way that the feed dogs maneuver the fabric and the way that sometimes the pleats come unfolded and are refolded during the sewing process can lengthen your skirt panel if you're not careful. If you are very concerned about this, you can do hand basting instead. Before getting started, trim the top of your bootlegger pocket and finish that opening with a zigzag stitch or an overlocking stitch. Then go ahead and pin it into place, lining up the seam allowances. These extra seam allowances here are over top of the opening, and they can either be folded under and stitched down to protect the raw seam allowances, or they can be used to create a French seam. I'm going to be doing it the easy way first, and then I'll show you the French seam. The easiest way is to simply stitch it down at the full seam allowance. As you can see, that's 1 1/4 inches, so that the opening of the pocket lines up perfectly with the side seam of the skirt, which we are going to sew next. Pull the pocket bag out of the way and pin it down. Be sure that your seams are lined up perfectly so that it doesn't wrinkle funky once it's all sewn together. This is a little bit tricky. You want to back stitch, but you don't want to pass and sew into the pocket bag, so go slowly and be careful. Other than that, the side seam is just a normal straight stitch with a back stitch at the top and the bottom. You can see here at the top the thread just barely kisses where the next line of stitching starts. To finish off your raw edges, go ahead and do a zigzag stitch along this seam line. Then turn your skirt right side out and iron this edge as neatly as you can. You may want to top stitch along this edge as well to really hold it in place, but I decided to just iron it. Now the harder and more professional way of doing this seam is to do a French seam on the pocket opening. To do that, you're going to pin it just as you would, and you're going to finish the top edge of your pocket exactly the same way that you did for the other one. The only difference between this method and the other one is that instead of sewing things together with the wrong sides out and 1 1/4 inch seam allowance, you're going to be sewing things with the right sides out and a 5/8 seam allowance. And once the seam allowance is sewn, you're going to trim your seam allowance so that it's nice and skinny and so that it doesn't get caught up in the next line of stitching you're going to do. Then you're going to turn your skirt inside out and you're going to iron that seam as well as you can before folding it on the seam line and continuing with another 5/8 seam allowance on your sewing machine. Remember to backstitch at the top and bottom of the seams, and the bottom of your seam is going to line up with the folded edge here, right where that ends. It's a little harder to see when you do it the French way. And then you would continue on and sew the side seam just as we did with the green skirt, and all that's left to do is to close the pocket bag. Start by doing a straight stitch and remembering to backstitch along the straight edge, and then close the bottom. When you sew along the bottom edge of the pocket, you're going to want to line up your pocket as it's going to lay on the waistband first, and then close the pocket so that it lays correctly and it doesn't wrinkle. You may also want to include a little snap so that the facing of your pocket stays in place and the lining of the pocket doesn't slip and expose your bare skin. On the side seam of your skirt, figure out exactly how long the seam should be by laying your zipper down and marking with a pin where your zipper ends. You're going to sew up the side seam to that point and no further. On the seam along the opening where the zipper will be inserted, you are going to do a basting stitch. You can either baste by hand or you can do a very, very long straight stitch on your machine and do that instead. I personally prefer to machine baste. Once you've basted this seam, you're going to iron it open. I chose the worst fabric to do this tutorial with, but you can see I've got the selvages open there and I'm just laying my zipper face down. I then pin it in place and I carefully sew all along the zipper. If this is your first zipper, I would recommend hand basting it into place first. This will make life a lot easier for you, and good luck, my friend. A zipper foot would make this process a lot easier, and if you have one, I would highly recommend using it, but if you don't have one, it is still possible to insert a zipper. It's just a little bit harder. Once you have your zipper sewn in, go ahead and unpick your basting stitches as carefully as you can. You don't want to mess up your pretty fabric. And then your side seam is done and your zipper is installed. Take a moment to feel proud of yourself. Kaylie skirt are a very versatile design feature, and I'm going to assume that you're cutting 2 pockets. This means that you need 4 of the pocket flaps to sew together right sides together, and 2 of the utility pockets. Be sure to mark your little pleat marks with a pin and some chalk or whatever fabric marking technique you prefer. Doesn't need to be perfect, it's just a guide for how you're going to fold to make a reverse box pleat. This will allow your pocket to have a little bit of depth to it. Baste the pleat into place, removing the pins as you sew, and then with a 5/8 seam allowance, sew around the edge of the pocket flap, remembering to backstitch. You're going to want to clip this very well so that once it's turned inside out, it lays perfectly flat and rounded. As you clip, be careful not to cut into the actual seam line. Turn your pocket flap right sides out and stroke the inside seam with your finger so that all the little curves get turned out as well as possible. You also may need to free them by clipping the nubbins just like so. Remember to press as well as you can, and then top stitch around this edge for decorative effect. Before continuing, finish the top edge of the utility pocket. Do this by folding the raw edge over by 1/4 inch and then again by a 1/2 inch. Sew this hem down with a top stitch on your machine. Once you've got your hem finished, you're ready to prep your pocket for being top stitched to the skirt. Go ahead and fold everything under by about a 1/2 inch and iron it really well. You want this to lay nice before you pin it to your skirt. You're going to pin the pockets to the panels that are immediately next to the side seam, and immediately next to the middle of your skirt. To attach the pockets, you're going to start with the pocket flap. Sew it down with the round side facing up and the raw edges facing downward, and attach it to the skirt with a straight machine stitch. Once the flap is attached, go ahead and lay the pocket on top. This is a good time to check and make sure that your pocket is the adequate size for your pleat. You may have to finagle just a little bit to make sure that your pleat and the pocket are the exact same size. Once it's ironed and sized appropriately, go ahead and pin it down. You're then going to take your pocket over to your sewing machine and do a straight stitch all the way along the edges to attach it to the skirt. Be sure to backstitch, and you may want to backstitch quite a bit so that your pocket can handle a lot of pressure and can carry around heavy items like your phone or wallet. Take your waistband pattern piece and fold it in half. Iron this crease well before continuing. And then you're going to sew along the line that you marked. Be very careful to leave the seam allowances unsewn. This will make your life a lot easier whenever you're attaching your waistband and stitching it down. And speaking of attaching the waistband, go ahead and pin it to your skirt panel. Be sure to keep the seam allowance folded under as you pin. You'll want one side of your waistband to be completely flush with the edge of the skirt panel, and the other side should have an overhang of about an inch. This is so that you can attach either your button or your hook and eye loops later. No matter what finishing method you want to do for your waistband, you're going to start out by attaching it with a machine straight stitch. I would recommend doing this because it won't affect the final look of the garment at all and will be much quicker than a hand-done stitch. Once that first pass is done, you're going to want to pin your waistband under just like so. And if you're going to be doing the stitch in the ditch method, make sure that the folded and free edge has a lot of overhang so that it is in fact being caught by your stitches. I like to pin on the very edge of where I'll be sewing so that I can follow my pins and know for a fact that there is fabric underneath where I'm stitching. Basically, for the stitch in the ditch method, you want to be doing your top stitching right on the seam where the waistband meets the skirt placket. This makes it virtually invisible. However, you may wish to finish with a hand stitching stitch so that it is truly completely invisible from the outside. For a hand stitch finish on your waistband, you're going to start the exact same way you did for a stitch in the ditch waistband. The only difference is the finishing step. Instead of top stitching on the machine from the right side of the clothing, you're going to stitch down the free edge of the waistband from the wrong side using a slip stitch. Basically, you do a slip stitch by taking just 1 or 2 threads of the main panel of fabric, and then by slipping your needle into the back side of the waistband and going back in and grabbing just a few threads of the main skirt panel. This creates a really professional looking finish from the inside and the outside. And to finish up the little gap that's created there on the edge of the facing, you can go ahead and do a ladder stitch. And your finished waistband should look something like this. For your hook and eye closure, go ahead and lay the overhang of the waistband on top of it where it's going to lie, and mark that line, and then install your hook closures with the loops of the hook facing the line but on the outside of it. This will prevent the hooks from digging into your skin because they're facing outwards, so if pressure is put on this section of the skirt, it's not gonna bump into you too much, and it'll keep them hidden. I like to do 3 securing stitches on each loop and then a buttonhole stitch all the way along the edging to securely hold it down. Also, this method looks pretty. Next, you're going to install your eye closure, and you're going to line that up with your hook and go ahead and stitch that in with the loop part, the big loop part of your eye, facing the finished edge of your waistband overhang. I'm doing the same method of 3 stitches and then a buttonhole stitch all the way along the edge of it because I like how this finishes it, and I'm using a color of thread that matches the exterior of the waistband. It will show a little bit the little thread marks, but I am not too concerned about that. You could install your hook and eye before fully finishing the waistband to prevent any marks from showing on the outside of the waistband. And your finished hook and eye closure should look something like this. I would recommend either doing 2 of the small hook and eyes, or if you're lucky to have one of the large hook and eyes, you will only need 1. For a buttonhole closure, you're first going to need to find the button that you want to use. I went ahead and marked its width on my placket, and I am just going to cut a hole large enough for my button to slide through. Be sure to test this a few times by sliding your button through the hole. And then you're going to do a buttonhole stitch all along the edge of this buttonhole. You start by coming in from the back of the fabric, and then you go back in towards the back of the fabric, and you place your needle through the loop you just created with your first stitch. You get a nice rhythm going with this, and it makes your life pretty easy. I would recommend using a nice plush thread like an embroidery thread, or doubling or even quadrupling up your thread so that it covers more space. Once I have my buttonhole fully stitched, I like to use a little bit of fray check on it, just to prevent any kind of issues in the future. Now, when you're sewing your button on, you don't want to do it close to the edge like this, because then you'll wind up with a gap and your facing will pull apart more than you want it to. So what you actually want to do is mark the farthest point in the buttonhole, so the far corner of the buttonhole, and then sew your button on there. Things are naturally going to shift in this direction anyway, and it will make your life easier. To start your hem, you're going to fold your fabric by about 1/4 of an inch. It's okay if it's a little bit more. Press this well and do that all the way around the bottom of your skirt before continuing. You're now going to turn your skirt up again by about 1.5 inches. Press this as well and do that around the entire edge of your hem. If you want to do an invisible hem, what you're going to do is fold the edge of your fabric so that you can stitch along just the end of the hem, and while doing what is essentially a modified zigzag stitch, catch only just the very edge of your main skirt panel, that folded section there, with just the tip of the zigzag section of the invisible hem stitch. This will securely attach the folded edge to the bottom section of the hem, permanently attaching them, while looking virtually invisible once it's unfolded and ironed. Alternatively, you could do a hand-stitched hem. To do a hand-stitched hem, you're going to iron and prepare it in the same way, and then take a needle and thread and do a basic hem stitch. To start my basic hem stitch, I go under the folded edge of my hem, and then I grab just 2 threads of the fabric of the skirt. And then I continue like this all the way along the hem of the skirt. Once you find the rhythm, hand stitching actually goes by relatively quickly. And even using contrasting thread, it is virtually invisible from the outside.
Now that wasn't so hard, was it? Like I said, if you got stuck in any parts or you need some help, feel free to leave a comment down below, and someone will help you out with it. Yes, you're a beautiful girl. You just want to be on camera, huh? You just want to be on camera. Anyways, I hope that you enjoyed this tutorial, and I hope that you're having fun with your Kaylie skirt. I would love to see what you wound up. With. Feel free to email me pictures or tag me on Instagram at Miah Grace Sews so I can see your beautiful creations. Anyways, until next time, I have been Miah Grace. You've just sewn an awesome skirt, and I'll see y'all in the next one. Bye, friends. Because that'll tell you all the ins and outs about this pattern and the other 2 that it comes with. You got an itchy puppy, huh? Real good scritches. You done now?